Becca Roberts was the kind of teacher that students adored and parents trusted without question. With her warm smile and friendly demeanor, she had a way of making even the most disinterested students engage with the material. She was in her early 30s, a striking woman with sharp features, curly brown hair that fell past her shoulders, and deep-set blue eyes that carried an air of both warmth and mystery. She had been teaching high school English for nearly a decade, and over the years, she'd built a reputation as a compassionate educator who genuinely cared about her students' success. The community saw Becca as a pillar of trust. Outside of school, she led a quiet life in a small suburban town, often found in local cafes, reading novels, or attending book clubs. Her interactions with the students seemed professional, even maternal at times. She would stay after school to help with assignments, listen to their personal struggles, and offer guidance like a mentor would. No one ever suspected the dark, destructive path Becca was silently walking, a path that would not only shatter her life, but leave a trail of broken young minds behind. It all began innocuously enough. Chris, a star athlete, was struggling in English. He was the kind of student who thrived on the field but faltered in the classroom. Becca had seen it before. Students, especially boys like Chris, were often intimidated by literature and struggled to connect with it. She decided to offer him extra tutoring, thinking she could help him stay eligible for the football team. Chris, with his chiseled features, broad shoulders, and confident air, was popular and carried a carefree charm that often hid his insecurities. He was always surrounded by friends, but there was something about the way he looked at Becca during their sessions that caught her attention. At first, it was innocent. Becca would tutor him in the afternoons, encouraging him to express his thoughts about the books they were reading. She found herself praising him more often than she should, making small, seemingly harmless comments about his progress. Chris responded to the attention, leaning into the validation she gave him in ways that felt more personal than academic. It was intoxicating for both of them, Chris seeking validation from an adult who saw him as more than just an athlete, and Becca, flattered by the attention of a young, vibrant student who looked up to her. Over time, their conversations strayed from literature. Chris would linger after their sessions, asking about Becca's life, her tastes in music, her views on relationships. Becca, lonely and craving excitement, began to let her guard down. She started sharing more personal details, how she hadn't been on a date in months, how teaching had consumed her life to the point where she had no time for herself. The boundary between teacher and student was blurring, though neither acknowledged it. The excitement of their secretive conversations was thrilling, but dangerous. The first physical contact was almost accidental. One afternoon, while sitting side by side on the couch in her classroom, their hands brushed. Becca froze for a moment, her heart racing, but she didn't pull away. Chris looked at her with a boldness she hadn't seen before, and that's when it happened. He leaned in, kissed her, and instead of stopping him, Becca kissed him back. It was a brief, breathless moment, and afterward both sat in stunned silence, the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavy between them. Becca knew it was wrong. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to stop, to step away, to never let it happen again. But something had shifted inside her. She felt desired in a way she hadn't in years. The thrill of doing something forbidden was intoxicating, and she found herself rationalizing it. He's almost an adult, she thought. It's just a mistake. It doesn't have to go any further. But of course it did. As the weeks passed, their encounters became more frequent, more intimate. Chris, emboldened by Becca's attention, started confiding in her about his frustrations with girls his age, how none of them understood him the way she did. Becca, starved for affection, started to believe that what they had was special, unique. The rational part of her mind, the part that knew she was a teacher and he was her student, began to fade into the background. She was no longer just Becca Roberts, the English teacher. She was someone who had been pulled into a world of secret desires and dark impulses, and she didn't want to leave. Chris wasn't the only one who noticed Becca's shift in behavior. Max, another one of her students, had always been sharp. He excelled in class and often stayed after school to discuss books with her. He had a quiet, introspective nature, and unlike Chris, he wasn't the type to seek out attention from girls. But he was observant. He noticed the way Becca smiled at Chris. The way her demeanor changed when he was around. It didn't take long for Max to figure out that something was going on between them. One evening, Max stayed after class longer than usual. The school was empty and Becca was preoccupied. Her thoughts elsewhere. Max, sensing an opportunity, approached her desk and casually mentioned that he had seen Chris leaving her classroom late one night. Becca's face went pale. She tried to dismiss it. But Max wasn't easily swayed. He leaned in, lowering his voice as he told her he knew what was happening. Panic gripped Becca. She tried to deny it, but Max wasn't looking for an explanation. He wanted something more. He wasn't interested in exposing her secret. He wanted to be part of it. He told Becca that he wouldn't say a word as long as she gave him the same attention she gave Chris. At first, Becca was horrified. Max was younger than Chris, quieter, more calculating. She had never considered him in the same way. But now, with her back against the wall, she felt trapped. The thrill that had once accompanied her interactions with Chris was now replaced by fear and guilt. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew it could destroy her career, her life. But the fear of being exposed was overwhelming. Max wasn't aggressive. He was patient, manipulative. He knew exactly how to push Becca's buttons, how to make her feel powerless. Over the following weeks, he would stay after class, asking her increasingly personal questions, making subtle advances. Becca, terrified of what he might do, found herself giving in, little by little. First, it was a touch on the arm, then a lingering glance, then more. By the time summer break rolled around, Becca was entangled in a web of lies and manipulation that she couldn't escape from. Chris and Max had become regular visitors to her home under the guise of extra tutoring. They were no longer her students. They were something else entirely. What had started as a brief, thrilling affair with Chris had spiraled into something much darker, and Becca no longer had control. But the worst was yet to come. Hobart and Wilson, two other students who had always admired Becca from a distance, began to suspect something was off. Hobart, tall and lanky, with a brooding intensity, had always been an outsider. He kept to himself, observing the world around him with a detached curiosity. Wilson, on the other hand, was more social, but also perceptive. He noticed the way Becca interacted with Chris and Max, the way she seemed distracted on edge. Hobart, with his cynical nature, was the first to confront Chris about it. Chris, cocky and unashamed, boasted about his relationship with Becca, even showing off texts and photos she had sent him. Hobart and Wilson, fascinated and appalled in equal measure, wanted in on the secret. They approached Becca separately, each with their own demands, their own manipulations. By the time fall came around, Becca's life had spiraled completely out of control. She was no longer a teacher. She was trapped in a twisted, destructive web of her own making, with no way out. Each of the boys had their own motivations for keeping the secret, but the power they held over Becca was undeniable. She was at their mercy, and as the months dragged on, the thrill that had once accompanied the forbidden relationships had been replaced by dread and fear. The boys had grown bolder, their demands more explicit, and Becca, terrified of losing everything, complied. But secrets like these don't stay hidden forever. By the time the school year was well underway, rumors had begun to spread. Other students noticed the way Chris, Max, Hobart, and Wilson acted around Becca, how they seemed to have a special connection with her that went beyond the classroom. Whispers circulated in the hallways, and though no one had concrete proof, the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. It was Hobart, cold and calculating, who made the first move to expose her. He wasn't content with merely having power over Becca. He wanted to see how far he could push things, how much control he truly had. One afternoon after school, Hobart cornered Becca in the empty classroom. He told her he was tired of keeping the secret, and that he was ready to blow it all wide open unless she did exactly as he wanted. His demands were no longer just for affection, they were for money, for favors, for more control over her life. Becca was paralyzed with fear. She had been so careful, so certain that she could keep the boys' silence. But now everything was unraveling. She tried to reason with Hobart, but he wasn't interested in listening. He wanted to see her suffer, to watch her squirm. The power he wielded over her was intoxicating, and he wasn't about to let it go that night. Becca sat in her small, cluttered living room, staring blankly at the walls, her mind racing. She had lost all sense of who she was. The boys had taken everything from her, her dignity, her career, her identity. She knew she couldn't go on like this, but she didn't know how to stop. The thought of going to the police, of confessing everything, was too terrifying to consider. She knew that if she came forward, her life would be over. She would be labeled a predator, a monster. Everything she had worked for would be destroyed. But Hobart didn't give her the luxury of time. The very next day, he leaked the first piece of evidence, an intimate photo of Becca with Chris. It was a small, grainy picture taken in her classroom when they thought no one was watching. Hobart had sent it anonymously to a few of the more gossipy students. And by the time lunch rolled around, the entire school had seen it. Chaos erupted almost immediately. Students whispered in huddled circles, passing their phones around, gawking at the image. Teachers caught wind of the rumors, but at first they dismissed it as typical high school gossip. However, the photo was undeniable. The faculty couldn't ignore it for long, and by the end of the day, the principal had been alerted. Becca's carefully curated world was beginning to crack, and it wasn't going to be long before it shattered completely. Chris, Max, Hobart, and Wilson all handled the situation differently. Chris, feeling guilty, tried to distance himself from Becca, but the damage had been done. Max, ever the strategist, kept quiet, letting the situation unfold while staying in the background. Hobart, having set everything in motion, watched with cruel satisfaction as the chaos spread. Wilson, the most social of the group, fed into the rumors, embellishing details to make the story even juicier. Becca, on the other hand, was falling apart. She had been summoned to the principal's office, where she was questioned about the photo. Her initial reaction was denial, but when confronted with the evidence, her resolve crumbled. The school administration immediately placed her on suspension pending an investigation, and she was instructed to leave the premises at once. As she walked through the halls, head down, she could feel the eyes of the students on her, judging, whispering, relishing in the scandal. Her stomach churned, and she felt sick with shame. By the time she reached her car, she was shaking. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the authorities got involved. But even as the investigation into her behavior began, Becca was still ensnared in the boys' games. Hobart wasn't done with her yet. He had more photos, more texts, more evidence that he had been collecting for months, and he wasn't going to stop until he had completely destroyed her. The next day, more photos surfaced. This time, intimate messages between Becca and Max. The text exchanges left little doubt about the nature of their relationship. And now the school had even more ammunition against her. Parents were outraged. Phone calls flooded the school, demanding answers, demanding justice. The local media caught wind of the story, and soon news vans were parked outside the school, reporters clamoring for details about the perverted teacher who had seduced her students. Becca's once peaceful life had become a living nightmare. Reporters hounded her outside her home, flashing cameras in her face, asking invasive questions. Her neighbors, once friendly and kind, now gave her cold, judgmental stares. She was a pariah, her reputation in tatters. And then the police arrived. Becca was arrested on charges of statutory rape, and her mugshot was plastered across every local news station. The boys were questioned as part of the investigation, and while Chris was remorseful and scared, Max and Hobart remained cool, calculating in their responses. Hobart, in particular, seemed to relish the attention, painting himself as the victim of an older woman's manipulation. Wilson, less involved than the others, distanced himself, claiming that he had no idea what had been going on. As the legal process unfolded, Becca was faced with the reality of her actions. She had crossed a line not just once, but repeatedly with multiple students. There was no way to justify or excuse what she had done. Her career was over, her reputation destroyed, and her freedom was at stake. The boys, once enamored with her, now saw her as nothing more than a cautionary tale, a woman who had let her desire fires lead her down a dark, destructive path. But the story didn't end with Becca's arrest. After her downfall, the boys tried to move on, but the experience had left a lasting impact on all of them. Chris, racked with guilt, dropped out of school and spiraled into a deep depression. He blamed himself for everything that had happened, unable to shake the feeling that he had been the one to set everything in motion. He distanced himself from his friends, retreating into a world of isolation and shame. Max, always the pragmatist, tried to use the situation to his advantage. He gave an exclusive interview to a local news station, painting himself as a naive, impressionable student who had been seduced by a manipulative teacher. The media ate it up, and for a while Max enjoyed his 15 minutes of fame. But the attention eventually faded, and Max, left to face the reality of what had happened, began to realize that his involvement had left a permanent stain on his future. Hobart, ever the instigator, continued to brag about his role in exposing Becca. But as the months wore on, his bravado wore thin. The other students grew tired of his constant need for attention, and soon Hobart found himself ostracized. He had built his entire identity around the scandal, and when it faded from the public eye, he was left with nothing. Wilson, who had been the least involved, tried to move on quietly. He transferred to another school, hoping to leave the past behind. But the whispers followed him. No matter where he went, people knew his connection to the scandal. He, too, was marked by it, unable to escape the shadow of Becca's downfall. As for Becca, she faced a lengthy court battle. Her defense attorneys tried to argue that the boys had manipulated her, that she had been vulnerable and lonely, but the jury wasn't swayed. The evidence was damning, and Becca was ultimately convicted of multiple counts of statutory rape. She was sentenced to several years in prison, her career and life in ruins. In the years that followed, Becca's story became a cautionary tale. The media moved on, the school eventually returned to normal, and the boys tried to rebuild their lives, but the scars of what had happened remained. Becca, once a beloved teacher, had become a symbol of betrayal and abuse of power. And the boys, once her students, were left to grapple with the consequences of their involvement in her dark descent. In the end, there were no winners in the story of Becca Roberts and her students, only lives that had been forever altered by a series of terrible decisions and a community that would never be the same. Becca's years in prison were long, grueling, and filled with regret. Her cell, a cold, unwelcoming space with bars that seemed to stretch into eternity, became her home. Each day felt like an eternity as she reflected on the decisions that had led her there. The student she had once loved, the career she had thrown away, and the life that now felt like a distant memory all haunted her, gnawing at her spirit. Prison was not a place for redemption, at least not in the way she had once imagined. It was a place where people came to terms with their demons. And Becca had many. At first, she kept to herself. Other inmates knew her story. They had seen it on the news. A teacher who had crossed the line with her students, a woman who had betrayed the trust of the community. There was no shortage of judgment from the women inside. But slowly, as the months turned into years, Becca adapted to the harsh realities of prison life. She became harder, more resilient, learning to navigate the unspoken rules of survival behind bars. Despite the trauma, something inside her remained restless, unfinished. The allure of being desired, of feeling important, still flickered within her. Prison had stripped her of everything, her identity, her dignity, her future. But it hadn't killed that part of her that craved validation. It was a dangerous part. The same part that had led her to Chris, Max, Hobart, and Wilson in the first place. And as her release date approached, Becca began to wonder what she would do with herself when she was finally free. When the day of her release came, it was surreal. After years of being locked away, the world outside felt both familiar and alien. The sun was brighter, the air fresher, but Becca was different. She was no longer the optimistic teacher who had walked into that high school classroom so many years ago. She was older now, tougher, and carrying the weight of her past like a scar across her soul. The world, too, had changed. The scandal had long since faded from the headlines, replaced by newer stories of tragedy and corruption. But Becca knew that she would never truly escape her past. The internet never forgets, and there were countless articles, photos, and videos documenting her fall from grace. When she tried to find work, the stain of her crimes followed her. Schools, of course, wouldn't hire her. Even menial jobs were hard to come by once employers recognized her name. Everywhere she went, people knew who she was. Some looked at her with pity, others with disgust, but no one offered her a fresh start. Desperate and out of options, Becca began to search for ways to survive. She was living in a rundown apartment, scraping by on government assistance, when she stumbled across a solution that seemed both shocking and inevitable: the adult entertainment industry. She had seen advertisements online for women looking to enter the industry: discreet, lucrative, and, for someone like her, accessible. No one cared about her past there. In fact, her infamy might even work to her advantage. At first, Becca hesitated. She knew what the world would say. The disgraced teacher now turning to porn, they would sneer. But in a twisted way, it felt like the only place she could reclaim some semblance of control over her life. The world had already sexualized her, demonized her, and discarded her. Now she could at least take that narrative into her own hands, monetize it, and find some sense of power in a life where she had lost so much. It didn't take long for Becca to make the transition. She started small, with anonymous videos on adult platforms, using a pseudonym. At first, she kept her face hidden, but the allure of making more money, and the need to step into her new identity fully, pushed her to reveal herself. The scandal surrounding her past actually boosted her visibility. Fans of the adult industry were intrigued by the idea of the teacher-turned-criminal, and before long, her videos were trending. The industry welcomed her in a way that society never had. It was strange, empowering, and deeply unsettling all at once. Here, she was free to explore her desires without judgment. Men and women paid to watch her, and for the first time in years, Becca felt in control of something again. Her body, her image, her story. It was hers to shape, even if it was through the lens of a camera. However, Becca's rise as an adult star didn't come without complications. The notoriety from her past was always present, casting a long shadow over her new career. News outlets caught wind of her transformation, and soon there were stories circulating once again. Headlines blared. Disgraced teacher becomes adult star after prison stint, and from classroom to camera, the shocking new life of Becca Roberts. The public couldn't get enough of the scandal. Critics were quick to condemn her, labeling her as someone who had only deepened her descent into depravity. Parents of the boys she had once taught and victimized spoke out, expressing outrage that she was allowed to profit off her past. But Becca, hardened by years of judgment, no longer cared about the moral outcry. She had spent years locked away, defined by her mistakes. Now, she was taking control of her narrative, even if that meant embracing a life of controversy. Despite the backlash, Becca's career in the adult industry flourished. She wasn't just another nameless performer. She was a figure of infamy, and that gave her an edge. People were drawn to her story, the teacher who had fallen from grace, only to rise again in a completely unexpected way. There was an audience for her, a market that thrived on scandal and taboo. And Becca became one of its most notorious figures. But even as she thrived in her new career, Becca was haunted by her past. The boys, Chris, Max, Hobart, Wilson, were never far from her thoughts. She wondered where they were, what had become of them, and how much they hated her now. She knew she had left them with scars, the kind that don't heal easily, if ever. They had been young, impressionable, and she had taken advantage of that. It didn't matter how lonely or broken she had been at the time. She had crossed a line, and they had paid the price. Years later, Becca found herself at the height of her career in the adult industry, but also at a crossroads. She had money, fame, and control over her life. But it had all come at a cost. The life she had before, the life she once dreamed of, teaching, guiding students, building a family of her own, was gone forever. In its place was a life of fame built on her darkest moments. As she looked in the mirror each night, her reflection showed a woman who had been through hell and back, a woman who had lost everything but found a way to survive, even thrive. But the question that lingered in her mind was whether this survival had come at too high a price. Becca Roberts had fallen, risen and fallen again, and now she stood in the glare of the spotlight, wondering if this was what she had wanted all along, or if it was just the only option left for her in a world that had turned its back on her. The boys, scattered in their own lives, would never forget what had happened. Chris, still battling his demons, often wondered what might have been if Becca had been the teacher she was supposed to be. Max, ever the opportunist, had moved on to college, but the memory of Becca lingered. Hobart, still bitter and resentful, lived his life knowing that he had played a part in her downfall. And Wilson, forever trying to escape the shadows of that scandal, tried to move on, but the memories remained. Each of the boys carried the weight of their involvement with Becca differently, but none of them could entirely escape the past. They all had their private struggles with guilt, confusion, and in some cases, the fame that came with being involved in such a notorious scandal. While Becca had become a symbol of sexual misconduct and moral failure, the boys had their own stories, ones that would never be fully told, ones that would linger in their minds long after the public had moved on. For Becca, the adult industry brought a strange kind of redemption. She was no longer the disgraced teacher hiding from her past. She was now the creator of her own narrative, even if it was controversial and looked down upon by society. The thrill of being in control, of being desired on her own terms, gave her a sense of power she hadn't felt in years. She convinced herself that she had risen above the shame, that she had turned her downfall into something profitable, something that made her relevant again. But deep down, she knew that something was missing. There were nights when the silence in her apartment was unbearable, when the clicks of the camera in her filming room felt hollow, and the adoration of her fans felt fleeting. Becca had never truly dealt with the guilt of what she had done to those boys, nor had she reconciled the person she once was with the person she had become. Eventually, as the years wore on, Becca started to question her place in the adult industry. She had reached a point where the fame was starting to fade, and younger, newer stars were taking the spotlight. The scandal that had once fueled her career was no longer a novelty, and the adult industry was as fickle as any other form of entertainment. The more she worked, the more she realized that she wasn't building a future. She was merely existing, living off the remnants of her past infamy. One day, sitting alone in her dimly lit apartment, Becca found herself scrolling through old articles about the scandal. The faces of Chris, Max, Hobart, and Wilson stared back at her from grainy school yearbook photos. They were older now, adults like her, but frozen in time by the events that had destroyed so many lives. Becca wondered if they had forgiven her, or if they still hated her for what she had done. She wondered if they thought about her at all. The guilt, the regret, the deep sense of loss began to weigh on her again. She had been running from it for years, hiding behind her new persona, but it had never truly left her. And now, with her career in the adult industry starting to lose its luster, Becca was left to face the reality she had avoided for so long. One night, Becca made a decision. She would leave the industry. She had made enough money to live comfortably, and she was tired. Tired of being defined by her worst mistakes, tired of living a life that didn't feel like hers anymore. It was time to start over, to leave behind the persona she had created and try somehow to find peace with herself. But Becca knew that starting over wouldn't be easy. The world would never forget what she had done, and she would always carry the scars of her choices. Yet, for the first time in years, Becca felt like she could finally move forward. Not as the disgraced teacher, not as the adult star, but as a woman who had made terrible mistakes and survived. She sold her apartment, packed her things, and moved to a small town where no one knew her name. It wasn't an escape from her past. It was simply a chance to live quietly, away from the chaos and the judgment that had defined her for so long. She found work managing a small bookstore, where she spent her days surrounded by the quiet hum of literature, far removed from the scandalous headlines that had once followed her every move. The years passed, and slowly Becca began to heal. She would never fully escape the consequences of her actions, and she would never forget the boys she had hurt. But in the quiet of her new life, she found a kind of peace. She wasn't the woman she once was, and she would never be the teacher she had dreamed of becoming. But she was alive, and she had survived. And that, for Becca Roberts, was enough. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and like this video for more true crime video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and theories in the comments section below. Take care and see you in the next video.